everyone, or good morning or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. It's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh, Senior Associate and Regional Director for Central and West Africa at the National Democratic Institute, as our speaker today. And a warm welcome to all of you, our audience, both those participating through Zoom and those joining via Facebook Live. It's wonderful to have you all at our Africa Programme event to discuss the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic for African elections and democracy. Before we start, I just want to give you all some guidance. During the presentation, you will be muted, but after Dr. Fomunyoh has spoken, you'll be able to use the raise hand function during the Q&A session, so you'll be able to ask your questions live. Please accept my apologies in advance if we don't get to you today. As you can see, we've got many participants at the event today, and the number will continue to go up. If you need to, you will be able to submit written questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try and take some written questions also. But as I said, we do encourage you to use the raise hand function. To those of you watching via Facebook Live, I do apologize, we're not able to take questions from Facebook Live today. And final notes, we are on the record, so as well as using information from the meeting, speakers and other participants may be identified. Please also note that filming and recording are not allowed today. Of course, you're welcome to tweet using the hashtag #CHAfrica. And just a few words about Dr. Fomunyoh before I hand over to him. As Senior Associate and Regional Director for Central and West Africa at NDI, Chris has organized and advised international observation missions in many African countries, including the Central African Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, Madagascar, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Nigeria. He's also designed and supervised country-specific democracy support programs with civic organizations, political parties, and legislative bodies in more than 15 countries. He recently designed and helped to launch the African Statesman Initiative, a program that works with former democratic heads of state in Africa on humanitarian issues, conflict mediation, public health, and other key sectors of development. So Chris, we entered 2020 thinking it was going to be a busy year of complex elections across the continent, but the pandemic has added a new layer of challenge and complexity. So over to you for about 20 minutes to share your insights on these and possible responses. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Lizzie, for those very kind words of introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I really want to take a moment to thank all of the participants for making an effort to log in and to participate in this conversation as we all try to adapt to new methods of communication and work, professional work in these very challenging times. Of course, I hope everyone is hunkering in wherever you may be and keeping safe. These are trying times. The only thing that can help us overcome this pandemic is the resilience that we as part of the global humanity can show in combating this pandemic. So thank you all for making the time today to be part of this conversation. As Lizzie rightly said, we were entering 2020 as a very crucial year for the African continent. It's been 30 years or 3 decades since what has been termed the third wave of democratization, which began obviously with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, but more specifically for Africa, with the end of apartheid in South Africa, the collapse of many military regimes and one-party states at the time. And in the past 3 decades, Africa has seen numerous cases of success. The number of countries that are now cited by international institutions, such as Freedom House and others, in terms of liberal democracies or semi-liberal democracies, has gone up for the African continent. But this hasn't come without challenges as well. I think that in overall, we continue to see some level of fragility within African countries, including countries that have made some progress and that in the past 3 decades have managed to put in place strong democratic institutions and practices. In a number of cases, we also see countries, notably in the Sahel and in the Horn of Africa, where there is political will to put in place democratic institutions, but where other new challenges related to violent extremism are undermining the ability of governments and citizens in those parts of the continent to be able to exercise their democratic rights and consolidate their democracies. But we've also seen some happy surprises in places such as Sudan, where after over 30 years of strong armed military rule, a very peaceful revolution took place, piloted by women and young and youth that have now created an opportunity where Sudan could actually transition into a functioning democracy. And also in a country such as Guinea-Bissau, where elections were recently held, elections that have now allowed or are now creating an environment in which that very unstable country could find a pathway to stability and democratic governance. This does underscore the fact that elections are important. And we all know that elections do not a democracy make, because even in some countries that have had one set of successful elections, there is no guarantee that they wouldn't be backsliding and that the next elections will be able to happen. So while we acknowledge that elections do not a democracy make, we also have to realize that elections are very significant because elections do test the strength of the other pillars of democratic governance, and they bring to the fore, through the electoral process, they bring to the fore the strengths as well as the weaknesses of each country's democracy. For example, the principle of separation of powers is tested in the electoral period because it is during that time that we see whether the legislature is able to enact laws that create for an enabling environment for meaningful and credible elections, or whether the judiciary is able to litigate election-related matters, whether it pertains to candidacies, nominations, or even election results in a way that will guarantee or assure the citizens that the judiciary is an independent body, it's a body independent of the executive branch of government. It's also during the electoral period that we see issues come to the fore with regards to political space, whether political parties are able to organize freely and candidates are able to campaign freely in all parts of the country, whether citizens are able to be brought into the electoral process without discrimination in terms of ethnic or regional background or linguistic differences, and whether citizens have a full access to be able to participate in the electoral process. It is also during the electoral process that we are able to measure the degree to which citizens can engage in their elections, obviously as voters, but also, as we've seen increasingly across Africa, as observers and monitors of their own electoral process. I'm really elated to see that in the past 2 decades, we've seen a flourishing of citizen observation organizations, or domestic observers, as they're called in some countries, of citizens who organize themselves and span and deploy across the national territories of their respective countries to be able to pass judgment on the performance of election management bodies and the conduct of elections in their own countries. It's also during the electoral process that we see come to the fore issues of press freedoms, the ability of journalists to write stories without any harassment, for people to be able to express their opinions about the political process of their respective countries without fear or favor. It's also during the electoral process that we see a good test of civil-military relations and the relations between security services and citizens, whether the police or the gendarmerie in Francophone countries or both are able to create an environment where citizens can enjoy their civic rights without any form of harassment, or whether it's a damn failure of the functioning of security services that brings to the fore their lack of professionalism in the way in which they conduct themselves. All of these points that I've just cited, I believe, make the case that elections are a process. They're not a one-day event that is staged solely on election day, but it's a an ongoing process with benchmarks and different phases that allow citizens to be able to participate in all of these phases, culminating in election day, of course, and the announcement and proclamation of results and acceptance of those results by all of the parties and their candidates. As you can imagine, coming into 2020, we now faced with situations where some of these tenets are beginning to show stress in the system. For example, with regards to constitutions, as we all know, the limits, the mandates of elective office are usually fixed in the constitutions of the countries, whether they're presidential term limits or limitations on the duration of service of members of parliament or even local councillors and mayors. And most of the constitutions across the continent did not foresee a COVID-19, and so did not make provision for the possibility that the end date of presidential terms or parliamentary terms could be tempered with. We also are seeing that election laws derive from constitutions, and election laws go into more specifics in terms of laying out benchmarks of multiple phases that have to be met by the election management body, that include issues pertaining to the delivery chain of election materials, the registration of voters, the publication of temporary voter lists for verification, the distribution of voter cards, and the ability to have a final voter registry that will be publicized to assure voters that those that want to participate in the electoral process would be able to do so. We also then, as a result, begin to remind ourselves that obviously there's never a good time for a pandemic. The human toll is enormous. The economic and financial repercussions or consequences are already being felt and probably will be felt for the medium to long term. The healthcare issues and challenges on the infrastructure of healthcare are already being felt and being feared for the most part across the continent. And here comes the political consequences that we'll be dealing with in some more details in this discussion. When I talked about the issue of term limits, I should first say, obviously, that we've got more than 10 African countries that are preparing to have national elections this year. 9 or 10 of them have to do with presidential elections. But in the case of Ethiopia, which has a parliamentary system of government, the parliamentary elections will determine the government of the day or the next government in Ethiopia. And Ethiopia is one of those countries that is already coming up to the issue of term limits, with the elections that were planned for August 29th of this year, but now have been moved back at the request or the behest of the national election body, which came to the conclusion that with COVID-19, it would be incredible or impossible to organize meaningful elections. The issue is now being debated amongst the political stakeholders with various options being put on the table. One, to ask the House of Federations to have an interpretation of the Constitution to determine whether there's some flexibility in terms of moving the election date. Other stakeholders ask for a more inclusive discussion on the issue that could lead to a more inclusive government that will run the country while it prepares for elections. We also see in a country such as Tanzania, and I would say Tanzania and Burundi, where the issue is being tackled differently, in the sense that on the one hand, you have almost a state of denial in terms of the real impact of COVID-19, and therefore a willingness to proceed with the electoral process as if the pandemic was not in existence. We would be looking out in those two cases on issues of political space, but even more importantly, whether the governmental management of the pandemic itself becomes a political and an election-related issue in which the governments could rise or fall without citizens gauge their management of the pandemic and notably of COVID-19. We also have issues pertaining to the debate on electoral systems that we now see taking place in a country like Somalia, where on the one hand you have citizens that believe that a democracy should have a one person, one vote electoral system, whereas some of the political elites, especially the regional and ethnic elites, believe that the old system should prevail, in which case each of the federated areas assembles and the elders constitute a group of selected electors who then determine who gets to hold office at the federal level. The issues that are being faced in a country like Somalia, to a lesser extent and in a different context, are also being dealt with in a context of a country such as Cote d'Ivoire and even the Central African Republic, where these countries were supposed to have elections in fall of 2020, but now have to deal with issues of electoral framework. In the Central African Republic, there's a desire by the executive branch to introduce legislation that would amend the constitution to allow the president to be able to extend his term of office. In the case of Cote d'Ivoire, the government has taken a different approach in the sense that because parliament cannot be in session, it's delegated to authorize the president to enact legislation by executive order to create an enabling framework or to supplement provisions of the electoral code that would make for the conduct of inclusive and meaningful elections. We also have an interesting development in the case of Malawi, where we have seen institutions such as the court, the civil society organizations assert their influence in the electoral process, which then led to the court ruling that the last presidential election needed to be rerun, and with elections being planned for July. As we speak, there's still questions as to whether Malawi is going to be able to hold its calendar and have those elections in July, or whether civil society and especially the security services will be able to conduct themselves in a way that would allow citizens either to participate in the elections, or should they be moved forward to create an environment where the country can continue to stay stable until those elections are conducted. We have cases coming up such as Guinea Conakry in a context that is already excessively polarized because of the debate over the constitution and whether the constitution of the country, which has now been amended through a referendum, is legitimate, and whether parties that boycotted the legislative elections in protest would be able to rejoin the process for presidential elections that should hold in October of this year. I could go down the list and also add Burkina Faso and Niger, which are interesting examples because these two countries are in the Sahel and therefore under tremendous stress because of their efforts to counter violent extremism, but where we see enormous political will to do the right thing. And our hope in those two cases is that they will be able to build the consensus that is required to allow them to conduct inclusive and meaningful and peaceful elections. Then we have the case of Ghana, of course, which continues to show the lead on the African continent in terms of its ability to obtain the alternation of political power through the ballot process. And I must say that since 2000, Ghana has gone through multiple presidential elections that have been extremely close, but which have had outcomes accepted by all of the parties and contestants. And going into 2020, the hope is that Ghanaian civil society, which is extremely vibrant, would continue to shed the spotlight on debates and discussions around the electoral framework, so that issues such as transparency could be prioritized in a way that whatever decision is made or arrived at will be embraced and accepted by Ghanaians across the board. The 11 or 12 cases that I have mentioned very briefly in passing do indicate that the second half of this year is going to reserve a number of surprises for us, that we would need collectively to strengthen the prioritization of the political issues that are likely to hit us. As if the COVID-19 pandemic wasn't sufficient, I dare to say that we probably would face multiple political storms in the course of the second half of this year. To conclude, let me just put a few points on the table with regards to the way forward. I believe strongly that for the rest of this year, 2020, and rolling over into 2021, Africa is going to be torn by two currents, two opposing currents. On the one hand, there's going to be the current of authoritarian opportunism, which would pertain to the cases where leaders would want to use the cover of the pandemic and COVID-19 as a pretext to shrink political space even further and to tilt the playing field for elections in a way that would favor either themselves or their preferred candidates and political parties. That's going to be one trend. And the second trend, which for me is the more hopeful trend, is the trend of democratic resilience, that despite these challenges, political leaders, elected officials, civil society, the media, all of the progressive forces that we continue to see across Africa are going to work collectively to make sure that the emerging democracies that we see on the continent come out of this crisis stronger. And to be able to do that, I believe 4 crucial values are going to be at play. The first one is to seek inclusiveness, to make decisions in ways that include more people into the electoral process than less, that broaden the political playing field than shrink it. Secondly, to work towards consensus, that even though we're in this age where fiscal meetings are extremely difficult, in a continent where technological challenges are enormous, that efforts should still be made to build consensus across party lines. And that should be done in a way that brings in opposition voices and also broadens the scope of stakeholders that are consulted when decisions need to be made. Thirdly, that there has to be a premium on citizen engagement. Fortunately, civil society has become quite adroit and astute in using technology to be able to communicate with citizens. And that unless voters are brought into the process, even during these trying times, the electoral process could become a very hollow process, and whoever gets declared as the winner may not have the legitimacy to be able to govern. And lastly, a premium on transparency, because I believe that when governments work in a transparent manner, especially when they organize competitive processes such as elections, that citizens tend to defer to them and to recognize that we're all in a challenging time. And as long as leaders can put their best foot forward and be transparent in the way in which they address the challenges, they're most likely to get the benefit of support from their fellow citizens. I'm hopeful that countries that follow these 4 cardinal principles would thrive and would come out of this crisis stronger and with their democracies strengthened. I've also been around the block a couple of years, or many years too long, to be able to know that all autocratic habits die hard, and that some of the countries that I've mentioned previously, I'm very likely to stumble. However, I urge each and every one of us, or all of us, to work as hard as we can to support the countries and the leaders that want to do the right thing. And that when next we reconvene, it would be to celebrate the success of democratic resilience across the African continent. I thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to responding to any questions that you may have.
Chris, thank you so much for that really detailed presentation on state of play in the continent and the challenges ahead, and also your call to action at the end to help protect that democratic resilience on the continent. We'll now move to the Q&A session. So just a note of reminder for those who joined us after Chris had started speaking, just that we are on the record today. And also that we'll be taking questions primarily via the raise hand function. I do see questions coming in the Q&A, and we'll try and take some of those as well. But I'll be selecting people from the raised hand box. So when I choose you, the Africa Programme team, who are currently working behind the scenes, will enable you to unmute yourself. So please do that. Please do introduce yourself using both your name and your affiliation when you ask your question. Please do ask a question rather than make a comment. And if you can keep it brief, that will really help us to get through as many questions as we can in the time remaining. And please don't worry if there are any issues with your audio, we'll try and come back to you. So Chris, if it's all right with you, I'm gonna take, because we have quite a few coming in here, I'm going to take questions in clusters of 3. So I'll start with Anthony Aja, please. Team, if you could make sure that Anthony can unmute himself. Thank you. Anthony, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Chris, for the contribution. I'll quickly go to, you made mention of what you called 2 possible political currents. The first, you talked about what you called authoritarian opportunism, and the second one, you talked about democratic resilience. The first one is a fear that there is a possibility of shrinking political spaces further, but I want to emphasize the hope in the second current. So my question now is, you mentioned that political leaders and civil societies can ensure resilience. But I want to ask, is there no possibility that these political leaders, in the process of re-ensuring the resilience, ensures that those who are likely to be authoritarian opportunists, that they are forced to indicate, for instance, the dates that whatever position they are taking on behalf of the country will expire, so that once those dates arrive, they return to the executives and say, we agreed on so date, it's time for us to continue from where we stopped. It's a question I want to see. I'm asking whether is there no possibility that the second current takes care of the first current you emphasize about authoritarian opportunism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. And we'll come to Eleanor Bennett, please, next. If you don't mind just introducing yourself, please. Thank you.
Hello, Eleanor Bennett, SOAS. What opportunities do African countries have to make elections held during this period fairer than most contested elections held?
Thanks, Eleanor. And then we've got Okechukwu Ubeanu, please.
Oh, hi, Chris. 2 quick questions. The first is on how African countries are going to deal with the cost of elections in the light of the economic conditions and the impact of COVID-19 on African economies. Could you say a few things about how this will affect the cost of elections and therefore elections generally? The second one, quickly, do you see different patterns where an incumbent is seeking re-election and where it is an end of tenure election? How will these two different scenarios play out? Thank you.
Thank you, Okechukwu. If I could ask, please, if you don't mind just letting us know where you're from, your affiliation.
Oh, okay. INEC in Nigeria. INEC headquarters in Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Okay, Chris, so there's your first few questions. Over to you there.
Thank you very much, Liz, and thanks for those three wonderful questions to get us started. In terms of the tensions between the two currents, the first and the second, and the hope that the second would override the first. Obviously, it's a hope that we all share, and that's why I reserve the best for last, because that's my hope as well. But we also have to be realistic in the sense that the context, in the context where the other actors have been weakened and handicapped by the crisis, where parliaments cannot meet as often as they've met before, where civil society cannot mobilize citizens into the streets or in petition writings or in public press conferences as they've done in the past, that the strongest arm of government, as we see right now, is the executive branch of government in most countries. And so there's an imbalance that existed in the past, but that has now been aggravated by the crisis. And so it's good to count on the goodwill of some of those that may want to experiment with autocratic opportunism, but I think the track record is there that that goodwill doesn't really pan out, and that in most cases, you have to strengthen the demand for better performance. And the fear is that if those actors that have traditionally demanded better performance with regards to elections and governance as a whole are handicapped by the crisis, we have to keep an extra pair of eyes on those that may be attempted to experiment with authoritarian opportunism. Because my experience has also been that once leaders can get away with an inch, they will try to get away with a foot. And we have to really look out for that. The Eleanor's question has to do with countries that have tried to organize elections within the context of the pandemic. And we had that experience in Mali last month, in March and in April, when Mali organized legislative elections at the time when the pandemic had already broke. It is true that at that time, the number of deaths were pretty low, or Mali hadn't yet recorded a high number of cases, but there were genuine and very legitimate concerns that by bringing people out en masse to participate in elections, that would further aggravate the spread of the pandemic. There were some consequences. We saw lower voter turnout, but what we saw in Mali, which was remarkable, and this goes to Eleanor's point, was that Malian civil society, through a coalition called COSEN, was able to mobilize over 1,500 citizen observers who respected the guidelines, the health guidelines in terms of social distancing, but were able to come out on E-Day to observe how citizens conducted themselves and how the election, what steps were being taken by the Election Commission to make sure that citizens who wanted to vote could do so without risk of being contaminated. It's a very risky proposition, and it happened at the beginning of the crisis. But now that we're right in the middle of the crisis, and the health experts are projecting that the continent may still be further hit as we get even into the summer season, that it wouldn't be advisable, especially in countries that already have high number of cases, to pick people out in their numbers and put them in this dilemma where they have to choose between survival and exercising their civic responsibilities. With regards to Oke's question, the cost of elections, that's a very legitimate question because a number of African countries have struggled to be able to fund their elections even under normal circumstances. And now with the economic and financial hardship that's being caused by the crisis, some of these countries are going to find themselves in even a more difficult situation with regards to the ability to fund their elections. We also know that there are a number of countries that have benefited from international support in terms of conducting those elections, in terms of financial and material assistance. But now some of the countries that have in the past provided that level of support are dealing with their own budget shortfalls and may not be in a position to be able to provide as much assistance as they've provided before. I do know, because our friend Oke comes from Nigeria, that within West Africa, there's so much solidarity amongst the countries and the election management bodies, where electoral materials such as election boxes, transparent boxes, have been transported from one country to be used in another country to help that other country organize its elections. I'm hoping that election management bodies across the continent can look for ways in which they can provide support and solidarity to each other during this moment of crisis, but also emphasizing that while you cannot organize elections without resources, resources cannot become the handicap, the reason for which good elections are not conducted. And let me just take the example of the Gambia, for example, where elections are conducted in a very unique system, where the Gambia has not invested in all of the new expensive technology. In the Gambia, voting is still conducted through marbles. It's an old and tested process, which is not that expensive, but which allows the citizens of the country to be able to state very clearly their preferences when it comes to elective office. So this is also a call to more reflection and better thinking and creativity on the part of election management bodies and governments across the continent to find creative ways of achieving the same results without investing in the expensive means that may not necessarily give them the results that we all expect and require.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'll take the next round of questions again from the raised hand list. So the next three will be Aminu Hayatu, and then Mark Kwakwe Frimpong, and then Stephen Adawen. So team, if you could allow Aminu to ask a question, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Aminu Hayatu. I'm teaching with the Department of Political Science, Bayero University, Kano, in Nigeria. So my question is that considering the fact that majority of countries are equating this pandemic situation with wartime, there are already fears that election periods are going to be treated a state of emergency. How then would you envisage that many African countries would not manipulate the situation with things like lockdown or amending laws that would require citizens to use electronic voting, which will ultimately affect the credibility of elections generally? If you look at the way elections are, in fact, being conducted among many African countries before this COVID-19 pandemic. So I'd like you to, provide a scenario where there is a possibility that elections could be held credibly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll come to Mark Kwakwe Frimpong next, please. Thank you. Hello, Mark, can you unmute yourself?
Okay, can you hear me now? Yes, so my name is Mark Kwakwe Frimpong, and I'm a PhD candidate in political science at Concordia University in Canada. Speaking about creativity for elections in this year 2020, I've been wondering the place and role of technology in ensuring transparency and legitimacy of electoral outcomes in order to deepen democratic resilience in in Africa. And I was wondering if Doctor has any ideas about how we can deploy technology. And we've seen that over the years, especially beginning in the 2010 decade, that several African countries have attempted to use technology. But the outbreak of this pandemic has also contributed to the a more prominent use of technology. And I was wondering if there could be a place and a role for technology in these coming elections this year.
Thank you very much, Mark. And just the last one for this round, please. So Stephen Adawan, we'll come to you.
Good afternoon to you all, and thanks for the opportunity. I'm Stephen Adawan. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. My question relates to similar issues that were raised by Aja in the first round of questioning, and that of Aminu, and of course, Mark. In the case of, and I was happy, Chris mentioned in the case of Ghana, because I'm from Ghana, about the current state of our democratic credentials. And in the case of Ghana, for example, we are currently seeing an increase in, is one of the countries with high rates of COVID-19 infections. And there are currently ongoing discussions and debates relating to a new voters register. In terms of technology, we are using biometric identification machines and all of that. And I'm sure Mark Kwachi Frimpong will attest to that. But the current issue is that in the face of COVID-19, people are saying that, look, there is no need for any new voters registration. And in relating that, but the government is still bent on going on with the registration exercise. And one of the requirements they're going to use for the new voters register is the new Ghana card that they're using. And if you look at the new Ghana card, not every part of the country has been adequately covered. So there's a potential that people will be disenfranchised. But in relating all these issues to your submissions you made about this authoritarian opportunism and democratic resilience, I fear that this issue of democratic resilience might actually translate to authoritarian opportunism, in that there seems to be a kind of like tacit endorsement of the actions of the Electoral Commission by the presidency, because there seems to be no, in the face of the COVID-19, the EC is still bent on even court actions. So what is your view about the fact that some of these issues could actually threaten countries that have probably, have some kind of democratic resilience in a while? What is your view on that and the possibility of that actually happening? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. So Chris, the next step there for you. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much for your three questions. And I think Stephen is right. His question and the question by Professor Aminu from Bayero University are very intertwined. They're interrelated. Obviously, there is a feeling in some countries and some discussions about approaching COVID-19 as if it was either an act of serious gravity, comparable to war, or an act of God, in terms of something that had not been predicted or wasn't predictable. And I believe strongly that the only way that countries are going to be able to approach that, if they took that approach, that it will become even more incumbent on them to be able to utilize the 4 principles that I laid out at the end. It's going to be incumbent of the government to be forthright with its citizens in explaining why this rises to the level of being considered an act of war, or that requires a state of emergency that could infringe upon the constitutional framework, the constitutional and electoral frameworks of the country. if you don't engage citizens, and if citizens don't buy into this, then invariably at some point, the crisis is going to be over, and the citizens who may have been so disenfranchised by actions that were taken while the crisis was on would definitely want to withdraw their legitimacy from whoever benefited from those actions during the crisis. I think this is a strong message that the media and civil society needs to continue to hammer in on and make part of the discourse in the various countries. Of course, the issue of biometrics and technology have helped improve the quality of elections. For example, in Nigeria, that has traditionally had well over 70 million registered voters. The introduction of biometric technology has helped to speed up voting, as well as voter registration, the verification of voters, and activities around the compilation of election results. In countries such as Ghana, Nigeria, and even Zimbabwe, Malawi, Zambia, we've seen how civil society organizations using new technology have been able to do election monitoring with new concepts and new methodologies such as the parallel vote tabulation, or what we generally call PVTs, that allow citizens to be able to track election results and to be able to track the activities of the election management body through all of the phases of the electoral process, including voting and tabulation of results, in a way that can allow them to speak to the veracity of the official results announced by the election management body. And this has happened thanks to new technology that allow observers, once deployed across the country, to be able to report on incidents in real time, and also to be able to transmit election results to their data center in real time. So in the context of COVID-19 and the coronavirus pandemic, technology could speed up or could continue to facilitate citizen engagement now that there are restrictions on the ability to be able to physically move from one place to the other. However, I believe that technology that's already in existence and with which citizens are already very familiar could become a real asset. The introduction of new technology by certain sets of governments or actors in the electoral process, if done without the consent of the broader public, may end up casting more doubt in the minds of the voters than one would sought to alleviate. And so we have to go back to the 4 principles of consensus building, of transparency, of inclusiveness, and actions that can be taken to enhance citizens' confidence that despite the crisis, decisions are being made in a way that will not end up favoring one party or one candidate over the other. I believe that in the specific case of Ghana that were raised by both Mark and Stephen, the Election Commission, the EC, has had a long-standing credibility, and it needs to know that its own credibility is on the line, and that if in 2020 it doesn't perform better or the same as it's performed in the past, that Ghanaian citizens are going to call into question the outcome of their elections. And in a country as vibrant as Ghana, with a civil society that's extremely active, with political parties that in the past have set up their own data centers to tabulate their own election results, it's going to be very easy for people to identify the shortcomings in the performance of the Election Commission, and the onus is on them to be able to give Ghanaians elections that the Ghanaian people can be proud of. And I think what pertains in Ghana pertains to the other countries in which election commissions have to be held accountable for their ability to give citizens the elections that they do deserve.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you for your questions.
Thank you very much, Chris. All right, I'm going to try to get 2 more rounds in. I think we should have enough time here. Those of you participants who have raised hands, please bear with me. I'm just going to take a few questions that have come through on the Q&A. So I'll just read them to you here, Chris. The first one I'll take comes from Bryce Bado from Sarap in Côte d'Ivoire, who asks, with the COVID-19 pandemic, people are more concerned about their health than anything else. If at the end of this health and economic crisis, populations are more impoverished, do you think that we should fear that elections in Africa would become more violent? I'll also take a question that's come in from Alex Folks, who is an elections analyst and observer, who asks, to what extent do you believe that the, in quotes, rally around the flag effect that tends to help incumbents in times of national crisis will occur in those African elections in the wake of the virus? Or will leaders suffer from the view that they could not protect their citizens? And the last question I'll take from this round for you, from Samson Etodo from Yiaga, which is also Nigeria-based. What factors should political parties consider if electoral management bodies insist on conducting elections amidst the COVID-19 pandemic? Okay, thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Liz. And another set of 3 excellent questions. The question from Mr. Badu in Côte d'Ivoire it's real because many countries, even including African countries that are not facing elections this year, would come out of this crisis fragile, more fragile than they were before the crisis, because a number of sectors of service delivery are going to be tested. And the inability of governments to provide services, social services, whether it's in health or in education or in public transportation, is going to strain, further put a stress on the relationship between citizens and their governments. And now if you add onto that elections that have been poorly conducted, then you enhance the possibility that violence could erupt. And I think that's the message that needs to be put out there so that decision makers can be cognizant of the consequences of decisions that they were to make, or the decisions that they make, should they make those decisions in a unilateral fashion without building broad-based support for those decisions. It's true, people worry about their health, people worry about being fed, but we also believe, and it's proven, that people want to be able to vote and eat at the same time. And it's incumbent on policymakers to integrate these expectations of their citizens in a way that can allow them to organize elections that will be violence-free. The second question had to do with how the management of the crisis and the pandemic could become an electoral issue. And I think the question is, the participant is correct, because when I cited the examples of Tanzania and Burundi, I would say those are 2 countries to watch in terms of whether the election is going to become a referendum on how those governments have managed the crisis. If it turns out that more people are affected and there are more deaths, and there's a sense among citizens that if the crisis had been better managed, that the countries would not have been this hard hit, invariably, those that manage the crisis will be beneficiaries of some level of goodwill. But if the reverse were to happen, and citizens feel that they're worse off because the crisis was not detected early, testing wasn't done, the infrastructure wasn't put in place to treat infected patients, and that the country is now worse off than it was before the crisis, then that could become a referendum in which citizens would seek to penalize those who were in authority at the time. And so it's interesting to see that there's never a silver lining with a pandemic like this. But one of the things that could come out would be elections based on issues where citizens actually make judgment calls based on policy positions taken either by those in power or by those seeking office. And this would shift the debate that we've seen all too often in some countries where the quest for elective office or the competition in the political arena is driven by other subjective considerations such as ethnic or regional affiliations. We would have to be looking out for those elements as well. And the last question from Samson, and let me just say a little plug here for Samson and Yaga Africa and the work that they're doing to be able to galvanize civil society in Nigeria and work in partnership with civil society coalitions in other countries to foster the use of technology in citizen observation. And also the work that Yaga Africa was able to do in Nigeria to encourage young people to become part of the political process with the Not Too Young to Run campaign. And his question had to do with, now that I've given a plug to Samson, I can't remember exactly what his question.
Sorry, Chris.
Yes.
That was a good plug, though. I've got it here for you. So it's about political parties. What factors should they consider if electoral management bodies insist on holding elections?
Sure. I think that political parties are major stakeholders in every election, and they should feel empowered to be able to galvanize other stakeholders within the body politic to have their case heard. And I'm thinking about the courts, and there are now many examples on the African continent to show that the courts are able to play an influential and positive role in being the arbiter of election-related disputes, whether they have to do with the electoral outcome itself or with incidents that occur in the pre-election period. We went through the court case in Kenya a couple of years ago when the court ruled that the presidential election was poorly conducted and needed to be rerun. We're now facing a case in Malawi where the court also came to a similar ruling and has now asked for a new presidential election to be held, where the court also asked the parties to return to the status quo ante, in which case the president and the vice president, who are from two different parties, are still in office because they belong to the same party before the elections. So we're seeing institutions such as courts standing up and being arbiters in a non-partisan way of electoral processes. And I feel that political parties that feel that their voices are not being heard should be able to petition the courts so that, as we saw even in Ghana some years back when they had very close elections, that courts could be able to render judgment in a way that would be binding on all of the stakeholders, including the election management body, and even including governments if necessary. That's one avenue. And then obviously there's also the court of public opinion, raising the awareness of citizens in terms of those grievances, and also making propositions that can convince citizens that the grievances are being raised not solely for the purpose of impeding the conduct of elections, but more for the purpose of contributing to the conduct of credible and meaningful elections. And I think that when you have the court of public opinion on your side, you have better chances going into an election than even if you're there for political parties. They may be tougher to accomplish under the present circumstances, but I believe that as long as those institutions exist, they should be appealed to and they would lend voice to the grievances that political parties may have. Thank you for that question, Samson.
Chris, thank you so much. Now, we are pretty much at time. If it's all right with you, I'm going to take a very quick final round of questions just because we've got quite a few unraised hands. But the people I ask, if you could be really brief in your asking, and then Chris will give his quick answers. So this time, and with apologies to those who won't get a chance today, Caroline Vierman, Maureen, And then Zenve Darlington Teme will come to you. So team, if you could please allow Caroline to speak. Thank you. Go ahead, Caroline.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Chris, for your thoughts. I had a first question on media freedom, of course, but I want to ask my second question. Where do you think the political dialogue can take place at the regional or continental level, especially regarding situations where, like Central African Republic, Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea, we may really fear violence and destabilization if the processes don't take place for the wrong reasons. Do you trust the regional associations or the African Union to be up the task? Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. And if you wouldn't mind just letting us know where you're from, please.
Oh, sorry. I'm working with the Fondation Hirondelle. I'm calling from Switzerland.
Thank you so much. And Maureen N, team, if you could please allow Maureen to speak.
Hello? Hello?
We've got you, go ahead.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. I have a quick question, a follow-up on your 4 principles of inclusiveness, consensus, transparency, and citizen participation. I'm wondering, when it is an authoritarian regime, definitely this will depend on the goodwill of that regime. And most often the authoritarian regime is not interested in inclusiveness or transparency. In my question then is, for countries which are under authoritarian regimes, what avenues do civil society, political parties, civil and political rights activists, what avenues should they use to ensure that the shrinking of political space is not exacerbated?
Thank you, Maureen. If you could just let us quickly know where you're calling from, please.
I'm calling from Kampala, Uganda.
Thanks very much, Maureen. And the final question for this event, please. Zenve Darlington Teme, team, if you could please unmute.
Hello, my name is Zenve Darlington Teme. I am the Minister Counselor at the Embassy of Liberia here in Brussels. I would like to say a big thank you to the professor for highlighting some of the very important issues. Like many other African countries, Liberia will also be going to a midterm election in October that has to do with the members of parliament. So my question is in furtherance to Alex's concern about the incumbency factor. So as we are aware that the consequences of the lockdown and all the drastic measures instituted by government has an impact on the daily activities of many African countries in terms of petty trade. People are not allowed to go out and food is scarce. So how does this affect the incumbency chances of re-election that wouldn't allow the tendency of authoritarian regime to spark up? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zenve. So Chris, to you for the final answers. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for those 3 excellent questions. And I feel like I'm really in family here because I know so many of you, and I appreciate that you were able to make time to be on the call. Caroline's question, yes, there's an issue on the continent in terms of the African Union's desire, using the principle of subsidiarity, to always defer to the sub-regional entities, the regional economic commissions. And so we have 5 of them across the continent. And of course, some are more active than others. We know, for example, that ECOWAS in West Africa is very active. It's got its protocols. It tries to do some peer review and peer pressure on various leaders. It tries to hold leaders and elections to a higher standard. SADC has also been making a lot of effort, but we know that in the Central Africa sub-region, ECAS is rather very weak. And so you're going to find that in some cases where the regional organizations are proactive, that we may see a lot more action coming from the regional bodies than we would see with regards to other countries. This may also be reason to begin to make the appeal that the African Union, in respect of its own charter, that is its Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, which is a very progressive instrument that the African Union should pay attention and should provide high-level guidance and leadership and encouragement in nudging leaders to do the right thing for their countries and their fellow citizens. Maureen's question is quite real. That's the challenge that an authoritarian leader to try to open up political space and allow civil society organizations to mobilize citizens and do their work. And that's most unfortunate. And if you look at the countries where political space is shrinking, they also have a track record of having contentious and sometimes violent elections. I think that two things can work here. One is for civil society organizations to appeal to regional and continental bodies to also have them as allies and cultivate them proactively into their case. And secondly, something that we're seeing more often these days is the solidarity amongst civil society organizations, to say that when things are happening in one country, that civil society organizations feel comfortable speaking out without having to wait for those things to happen only in their own countries. And so that level of solidarity can allow organizations based in Kenya or in Tanzania or in Malawi or in Botswana to be able to express their views about the in Uganda may face, trying to make sure that they create space for inclusiveness and consensus building and transparency and citizen engagement around elections. The last question and real comment from the Minister Councilor Seme in Brussels is that Liberia has made tremendous progress in the last decade and a half. And the hope amongst Liberians and friends of Liberia is that the country will continue to build up from the distance that is made so far. And I think that's a message that needs to be communicated very clearly to various stakeholders. Policy making around a crisis is a two-way sword, because if you put voters in a situation where, because of the lockdown, without other accompanying measures, people feel angered by the policies that are being implemented, you can be sure that when it gets to election time, they're going to express that anger through the ballot process in voting out those that took policies that were hurtful on citizens. It's important, therefore, to create avenues for communication to continue to occur, to create avenues so that civil society can transmit to elected officials and about various measures that are being taken. And it's that sense of broadening the scope in terms of adding voices to the conversation about crisis management that can help make sure that whenever the next elections are held in Liberia for the seats in parliament, that they will be such that citizens can come out and participate in the process without feeling aggrieved or without violence occurring. I definitely see that this is a conversation worth continuing. We probably have only scratched the surface on countries that may be of interest to some of you, or issues that you may have wanted us to delve into in much greater depth. I hope that Chatham House will be gracious enough to find other opportunities for us to reconvene and either take stock of what has happened or continue to plan the pathway forward. So thank you once again for making the time, and thanks Chatham House and Lizzie for your wonderful, this wonderful opportunity.
Oh, Chris, thank you so much. And thank you. Indeed, there is much to discuss. And we will be continuing with our event series online and looking at, and we'll be hosting country specific events. But Chris, I mean, thank you for, you've dealt with such a diverse set of countries and challenges and issues so comprehensively. So we're really grateful for that. And thank you for spending this time with us. Certainly we'll reconvene and continue the conversation. But thank you for, the important issues that you have raised, but also helping us think through how we can navigate all of these and support different stakeholders. So to our participants today, thank you very much. Apologies again to those who didn't get to ask a question today, and apologies to those whose names I might have mispronounced as well. I'm sorry about that. But wishing you all a good remainder of the day, and thanks again to our speaker. Chris, I'm sure our over 250 participants are loudly applauding you right now. So thank you, and see you all again soon. Bye-bye.